Why do people believe in narratives? Welcome to this special event as part of the Elevate Network. Today, in partnership with Reaching People, where we've invited the founder of Reaching People, David Charalambos, to join us for a 90-minute conversation around why people believe in grand narratives, what leads people to taking certain positions, how do people go into a conversation both believing they're entirely right, despite their opposing views. Why do we continue to try and convince people based upon data? What is our addiction to doing so, and why is it flawed? We're going to address a whole manner of questions throughout this interesting discussion with David. Now, David, just to let you know, had some technical issues prior to recording this particular event, so you may want to listen to this in audio only. You can also check it out on our podcast at Elevate with Dan Aston Gregory on Spotify, Apple, every major audio platform. If you're not yet a member of our private community, the Elevate Network, you can join us at weareelevate.org. It's a private community of change makers, activists, free thinkers who are exploring many of the different world issues that we are facing, trying to make sense of what's going on in the world, and ultimately exploring solutions so that we can live a better life. So come and join us at weareelevate.org. And if you join as a paid member, you'll have access to all of our previous events, plus our upcoming events over the coming months. So we encourage you to check out our supporter program, where you'll have access not only to our online community, but much, much more. Anyway, for now, enjoy this conversation with David Charalambos. As always, a truly insightful discussion, and we look forward to hearing your comments about this particular conversation. And of course, we're more than likely to have David back again over the coming weeks to continue the conversation. So we hope to see you at weareelevate.org. Enjoy this discussion with David Charalambos.
So yeah, really, I think we've been going deeper and deeper because we pretty much started to really understand how the authorities and corporations were influencing people. So what was it, how they were slanting certain media articles, how they were making one decision more attractive than another. But it's really when we start looking at what are the deep needs of a human that we start understanding why they work. Okay, and also there's some very interesting things that I think as humans we have to come to terms with, is that we are influenceable. 10 to 20% of people tend to be much harder to influence than others, and they generally are the ones that are challenging the narrative. But there's this thing about where our viewpoint is the default mode where we think we're correct. Okay, so as Lee Ross talks about it, you're driving down the motorway and all the maniacs are driving too fast and all the idiots are driving too slow. That's the default, what the brain does. And it's when we understand that, we start to really understand why is it in a conversation, two people are absolutely convinced that both of them are correct, even when the viewpoints are completely opposing. So it starts to explain a lot of the politics. But when we start to understand what is it that we need as humans? What are the deep needs that we have? You start to see why, when certain narratives sort of scratch on those, that people start behaving in a certain way. Does that become a pattern where you start to see that, and one of those deep five needs is safety. And obviously, I know many people talk about we're living in a culture of safetyism now. You can't even go into the supermarket without them telling you that they're keeping you safe. I mean, when we were children, it was like the supermarket's role was never to keep you safe, any of those places. So yeah, it's very interesting. But also what happens is a lot of this stuff goes subliminally. This is the thing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's what I think so many of the audience will have experienced. Is that once they see it, they can't unsee it. And then what you get is you get this second stage, this objectivity illusion, is we have undue optimism that all we need to do is show somebody our viewpoint and they will change. And then, of course, the third stage of this objectivity illusion is if they don't change, they're an idiot. And that's really what most modes are in the brain. We need to break out of this to understand what's going on. Does that give a sense of where we're going, Dan? Hello?
David, I just want to check whether it's my side where the sound appears to be lagging. No, I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it. Yeah,
I think playing up a little bit.
Yeah, so we're having problems from your side in terms of your connection. I think I thought it may have just been mine, but according to the comments, it looks like we're having some issues with your connection. You've frozen. I don't know if you want to drop to audio only for a moment just to see if that resolves the situation.
I do believe it's my side.
Yeah, you're showing full red bars. Signal,
yeah, well, see, my internet's gone down, and I'm now. Hello, is that anybody?
Where's he gone? I've lost you. So you've taken your video off. It looks like you're still there. You're currently muted, David. So you've turned off your video and your audio. So if you could turn your sound back on. Sorry, everyone.
Hello. Yes, when I come back in, it basically muted me. Yes, my internet went down about 10 minutes before this call started, which is very interesting in terms of its timing, but I'm now literally off my phone. I've connected that to the laptop. So we're going to do all we can to keep going, and hopefully at some point the internet will come back up.
Yeah, interesting challenges we face in this time when anyone.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you, David. There is still a lag, but it's slightly better than when we had your videos. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how these things happen with those of us who are dissecting some of these things. Maybe it's a coincidence. We've become quite familiar with coincidence theories, but so you gave some context around the way people see the world and why perhaps there's some disconnect. Where does this take us in terms of understanding how people subscribe to kind of dominant narratives? What's the kind of latest developments in your thinking around what we're witnessing?
Yeah, so what we have is it's really to understand when we start to look at ourselves and other people as really what are the elements to someone's personality or their brain that govern their behavior. And some of the real brilliant models break it out into 3 different aspects. We've got this rational part of our mind, which is where we kind of think we're in control of everything. So this is where we calculate, we think, we reason. But then we've got this unconscious part of our mind, which is really an animal side of us, which is when we're threatened, we will go straight into this fight or flight, and we will be into this emotional side of our mind. This emotional side of our mind is irrational because it's not really about logic, it's about protection. And this is why it's really key to understand where Sage's tactic of scaring people, why that is so effective, because then people start acting very irrationally. Now, then the third aspect, which is really, really key and will open up so much for people to understand, and that's this sort of map. How do we know anything? How do you know the color green is green? That's all in your map, and that's where we store things. And all you would really have to do if you were to push a false narrative is invert something in that map. So if you look at, for instance, you could take any one subject, take masks, for instance. 2 people having a conversation. One person will see the masks as security and protection, and the other person will see the mask as a threat. Yeah, and what you'll have is that the same stimulus is providing completely opposing responses. And that's why the propaganda and really the media and the education are probably 2 absolutely essential things within society. And if they get influenced by special interest, you're going to see some very, very bizarre behavior, okay, which is almost going to go 180 against reality.
Yeah, so could you explain the kind of map component of this a little more? Because, you mentioned, we refer to the color green, but we don't. I'm looking at some beautiful green plants in my kitchen, but we don't know how other people see the color green. But when it comes to, say, something like a mask,
yes,
people do. Well, they may have varying maps of the world when it comes to what masks are. You know, if you've come from Asian culture where they're more normalized in general life, in China, Japan, for instance, or, you know, if you work in the medical sector, you're familiar with seeing people wearing masks in surgical environments and other medical settings. So some people may already have some of that map of the world, but in the context of which we experienced COVID, where all of a sudden we went from those abstract understandings based upon our kind of normative daily lives in the United Kingdom to then masks being worn, firstly, initially voluntarily, as early as kind of January, February 2020. I remember seeing people wearing masks. And then, of course, later on, more commonly, and then mandated, you know, mandatory masks. So could you explain the MAP principle as it pertains to, say, looking at something like masks? Because, of course, that was a very divisive topic.
Very much so. So what you've got is that anything that's in the map effectively will be put in there via experiences, via stories, and also via classical conditioning. So you know about Pavlov's dogs. So, you know, so much of advertising is effectively showing a picture and the person creating association in their mind. That equals this. So what you have is it's really the reservoir of all your beliefs, your understandings, your viewpoints, all these things. Now, why is people through history have understood that it is really just a repository? And if something's in that map that's not correct, then that's where they're going to understand themselves deeper, and they're going to, you know, correct some misperceptions. Now, the lack of awareness that we have as a species under how this functions is one of the biggest problems that we have. So people are led into a real false sense of security. So if we take characters in our project and we have them represent, you know, people within the public to explain what's going on. So we have Jane and we have Joe. Jane completely challenges the narrative and Joe buys into the narrative. And what we have to understand is that they are standing on kind of this box, which is their map. And that map gets projected into their conversation. So if Joe has been watching, you know, lots of, or he's read certain scientific studies that say masks are effective, he is then potentially going to put masks equals safety, masks work into his box. And then he's going to have this complete false sense of security that that's truth. And then he operates from that position. He projects that truth into the conversation. Jane, on the other hand, may have, you know, worked in the mask industry, saying she knows that the mask, the virus particle is far smaller than the holes in the mask. And she says, well, this is like pointless. So she's operating in this instance from experience, whereas Joe's operating from a story that has been provided. And this is what's really key, because we live by the stories that we're given or we tell ourselves. And what we do is that we often lock ourselves into those stories, and we are always or often convinced that those stories are correct. And we're often convinced that everyone else has to change their story. So really, this is, for me, what science is about, is for people to check what's not only in their map, but really what's in reality, and be objective. And it's very difficult to be objective. And this is one of the big problems. And one of the reasons why fear is such a dangerous thing to be using is that fear evokes this animal side of our brain, this emotional side, and we call it the gorilla. So, and we call it that because you don't want to trigger the gorilla. If you're talking to someone and you say something that they don't believe to be true, there's a good chance that you're going to trigger this gorilla. When that gorilla is active, the gorilla is very irrational. If the gorilla is entering information into the map, it can enter completely irrational things into that map. Makes sense? So an example of Joe Bloggs, when he was a child, he read out a poem in school. The other children laughed at him. The gorilla comes out and it says, right, public speaking is dangerous. Puts that into the map. Then Joe grows up to be a very clever young man. Like, he has a PhD in mathematics, but he has a public speaking phobia because of that experience. But because that part of the brain doesn't have access to linguistics, it can't tell Joe, this is why you're scared. So all Joe gets is this phobic response, and he moves away from public speaking. And then he's going to rationalize why he does that. Does that give you a sense, Dan, of what's really going on here? Because it's really this connection between these three parts of us that's so key.
Yeah. So in terms of then influencing someone's map of the world, I know that you and I have spent time with Matthias Desmet exploring some of these things, but why is it that some are more prone to kind of conditioning based upon the narrative when it comes to adopting a map of the world versus others who are more, I don't know if the resistant is the term to use, but I'd be curious to explore why, some people take on a worldview or a belief system and others don't.
Yes. Well, this is a really key question. And what you've got is you've got effectively filters. So within the map itself, lots of the belief systems are filters. So if you imagine someone had a filter that survival of the fittest, yeah. So you get a lot of Wall Street traders that are right, survival of the fittest, we're going to destroy all other companies, etc. But you'll have other people that have survival cooperation. So those two filters being different will dictate behavior completely differently. There's a couple of filters in there, which really, some of these filters or belief systems are hardwired into us from evolution. And what you have is that being part of groups and listening to authority has historically been something that we do as a species, because you'll get someone that'll be very knowledgeable on something, and it's very wise to listen to the knowledgeable people. But what you have nowadays is there's a collection of people on the planet that understand what are these buttons, and what they do is they present information in such a way that it pretends to be something it's not. So they present information that pretends that it's from an expert that you can trust. That triggers that deep thing in the brain that says, okay, this is solid. And one of the most common things you'll see for people that believe the narrative is they will say things like, there's a scientific consensus. So you've almost got this unconscious checklist. Is this piece of information true or false? So it's the scientific consensus, it's in the mainstream media, it comes from people with a suit and a tie on, PhD, etc. Now, those people, those of us that do not believe that anymore, have literally had an experience where that wasn't true. Yeah. And a lot of the time it's a big experience. Yeah. So once that big experience makes it into the map, you can, let's say you had a family and they were conned, by someone in authority, they would then be much less to listen to someone in authority. If someone was able to stay much more rational. So there was someone, I think it was Gabor Mate, that was talking about, and it was quite a ridiculous thing to say, but there was an element of truth to it, where he was saying a lot of people didn't get the jab because they were traumatized. Now, what he's kind of saying is people have stopped trusting the authorities because they've kind of been traumatized by that. Now, the question really is, should they stop trusting them? And I think Julie Ponence on Monday night was talking about this, when the history has a lot of information to tell you that you should take anything said from government with a little pinch of salt, and well, in some instances, a big pinch of salt. So what you've got effectively is this set of filters that really is like a checklist.
David, I think you've dropped out again. We lost your sound. I don't know if you're muted or you've got connection issues again. Can you type in, if other people have lost sound as well, could you just let us know in the comments so that I know it's not just my side? Lost sound. Okay, so David, we've lost you again. Gremlins, you must have been onto something. I think we've just got back. David has joined us. For those of you who have just joined us, David is using mobile internet to join us. He is still here, he says. I can't hear you. Do you want to just try and interject again? He's disappeared. Apologies for this, everyone. So David has had some internet gremlins at his home, and he's dialing in via mobile broadband. Zoom is normally be reasonable on mobile, so hopefully he will be back and everything will be okay. But literally his internet went down minutes before we were about to start this session. So he's with us on mobile. So if you're watching live or you're watching the replay and you're thinking, where's David? Unfortunately, we're dealing with these technical issues. Really interesting points so far. And it was waiting for David to join. He's back. He's back. Okay, David, do you want to unmute yourself? I'll come and track you down. Your sound was getting clearer, so but it then suddenly dropped out, and I lost this mid flow. So
right, can you remind me where we were? Which bit did it drop at?
I don't recall, actually. My brain went into how do I solve this problem.
It dropped as you were talking about the checklist, David.
Okay, brilliant.
That's
So
right.
yeah, so what you've got is this checklist is largely unconscious, and then people will try and rationalize, why they believe something or not. But so much of people's first impressions, etc., a lot of these kind of influence effects that go on. And what's happened is that the behavioral science team have really understood these so deeply that they can present an piece of information that's so compelling that if you're not very conscious when you're watching it, it literally can make it into your unconscious mind. So effectively, this map can be influenced by people without your consent or knowledge. And someone like Derren Brown, who's a brilliant magician, demonstrates this in many different videos that he makes. There was one video where he was in Las Vegas, and he managed to convince a lady that red was black and black was red. Okay. He then took her into the car park and had her point out her car. She said, well, that's my number plate, but it's the wrong color, which is kind of astounding. And then in another one, he had advertising execs where he come up with an idea of what he wanted for a company, and he had them come up with the same ideas. And people were like, wow, how did he do that? And then he showed you the journey to the place where they were, and he had put loads of subliminal messages in there. So the way that the brain works is that we're always being affected by what we observe, and always being affected by what we don't notice that we observe. So a very clever marketer, and that's what a lot of narratives are now, it's really marketing and public relations, can create a situation understanding that when someone watches it, they will adopt a certain belief and a certain understanding from that situation. And of course, that's what we're seeing now. And it's really when you get to the depths of how this works that you really begin to understand why people see things the way they see them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you talked about is this idea of consensus. And, I think there's an element of manufacturing the illusion of consensus. And that's, what we've seen for the last couple of years is very aggressively any quote unquote dissenting voices. And dissenting is, I use that term merely to describe anyone that held or put forth an alternative perspective, insight or data set on the mainstream narrative, were censored, deplatformed, ridiculed, smeared, ad hominem attacks. The data usually stood robust. It was interpersonal attacks that ended up smearing, and of course then that discredits and removes their authority. So you've got on one hand the kind of manufacturing the illusion of consensus, which we've seen done, I believe, at an enormous level, specifically within COVID-19. But I'm almost sure it would have done in other contexts. But then, as a result, the authority principle is then challenged, because if people are, rather than being challenged on their insights, the science, the data, their character is being smeared, then that effectively, in the public's eye, if it's coming from a source that they believe to be more authoritative, removes the authority from the speaker. Could you speak into how that affects people's perception?
Well, it's really key, because particularly if you can paint that person to be immoral. So there was one of the political campaigns in the US where they did subliminal messages of a rat while the politician was coming up, and they showed that it literally dropped that person's approval ratings, because most people really, because this is what's going on, it's associations. So A equals B. So because most people have, because of history, the Black Plague, etc., most people have a very negative view of rats and rodents. So then by putting the rodent next to the person, you're effectively doing the opposite of what you would do being putting David Beckham or Michael Jackson next to Pepsi. Because effectively that's what's going on in the mind. It's going, oh, that's with that. So they associate the two. So what you have is if you can associate negative feelings with someone, then the person is going to move away from that perspective. And the consensus, the illusion of consensus is so important, because social proof is another thing that we have in our mind, which is unconscious a lot of the time. If everyone's doing it, it must be a good idea. That's the general thing. And historically, that's not such a bad thing, because if you're looking for food and a group of people walk towards a certain field, you think, okay, they know something, I'm going to join them. So that's where these things are hardwired into us. We respond to them often without thinking. And then what you get is that there's this, so if we take this forward now and think, okay, so what's triggering these needs in people? So we have 5 basic needs. And if I talk about 3 of them, so one of them is that we have a need to be socially accepted, okay? Now, when you look at Facebook and all the other social medias, what they're doing is they're giving the illusion of being socially accepted. Okay, so, you know, lots of likes, Facebook profiles, all these things. The second one is we want to be a part of groups. So what the narrative has done is it said, if you don't do what we say, we're going to reject you from society and we're going to reject you from the groups. This places extreme stress on the human. It's very traumatic. So then a lot of people will just cave in, because the brain loves easy things, not so much us as our personality, but the brain wants it easy. So if you get to a field and someone's already, and it's the grass is 2 foot high, someone's already walked through a pathway, where are you going to go? You're going to go for that pathway. So the brain always wants to do the easy thing. So what they do in choice architecture, which is they understand how we make decisions, and then they make the decision they want us to make, basically walked with the grass. And the decision they don't want us to take is painted with sludge. So one is painted with Teflon, one is painted with sludge. So what you've got is, if you imagine someone's watching, you know, a group of people in the high street, and they understand all of this, they're going to design the environment where they will benefit, not the people, the person designing the environment. So supermarkets are a great example of this. If you go into a supermarket where you're hungry and you're not very conscious, you're going to come away with a very big like trolley of food that you probably don't even want. So these 3 things, 3 of the 5, which is we want to be accepted, we want to be part of groups, and we want to be safe. So if you trigger removal of those things in people, they are going to seek them extensively. So you imagine, I mean, we talked about Rat Park before, didn't we, Dan? So, you know, Rat Park is where the theory of addiction before was, you know, you give someone drugs and they get addicted. But in fact, you only get someone addicted if they don't have their needs met, because they're seeking external needs and wants. And because the brain, there's 2 parts of the brain, one governs the wants, one governs the needs. If your needs are not met, that part of the brain is going to seek its wants. So effectively, most of this marketing is to scare the shit out of people, get them socially rejected and rejected as part of groups. And that's going to apply so much pressure to comply. And if you're someone that really thinks that a lot of the stuff that's going on is just a little bit of corruption, it's not, you know, very serious, then you can understand how a lot of people would just cave in, wouldn't they?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to pick up on here in the context of fear. As you were speaking, you know, for those of you who don't know, my son is nearly 1 year old now, so little baby boy, crawling around like crazy, trying to walk. Now, anytime that anything that frightens him, he turns and immediately looks for either myself or Lizzie, my wife, when he's in that fear. He's looking for reassurance, he's looking for comfort, he's looking for safety, he's looking to have that need reinforced. Now, that's a very, I would suggest, normal reaction for a less than 1 year old who is just discovering the world. And I take great joy in seeing the magnificence of the world through my son's eyes, learning how lights go on and off, and his just smile as he sees this happen. But for someone who's 1 year old, it makes sense when you're afraid to defer to authority, in this case, myself or my wife. Probably a better choice to go to Lizzie. She's far more sensible than I am. But when it comes to adults, when we're in that fear space, is there something from a psychology that kind of can tell us why we almost go back to that childlike state and turn for reassurance? Is it primarily just about meeting that baseline physiological need of safety, comfort, or is there something deeper? Are there other factors in this why grown adults who are supposed to be mature adults kind of revert to that almost childlike behavior?
Well, if we look at it, it's a really good question, because when the emotional mind gets triggered, it's fight or flight, it's many other things, very emotional, but it's very irrational. It's not going to calculate, does 2 + 2 = 4 and all those things. It's just going to look to, in a primal instinct, get me safe. Yeah. And then what you have to think about is that the map, which is, the whole lifetime of all our experiences, that if the map contains, and think about this, from the age of before the first day at school, everything is about listening to authority, following authority. And it's so unconscious. And Danny, the social experiment guy, he really demonstrated this, because he walked into a park in Hyde Park with a loud tannoy and a yellow vest on during one of the lockdowns. It was one of the sort of less strict ones. And he started telling people what to do. And they all just started doing it. Yeah, no one questioned it, because it unconsciously triggered, oh, there's a personal authority, I need to do as I'm told. So what you have is, for a large amount of people, and this is why, when you look at Eric Clapton and Van Morrison saying, like, where have all the rebels gone? Those that push against these things, it could possibly be the safety catch in nature to make sure we don't end up in too big a mass formation. Because what the people are just responding unconsciously. Now think about this, because what you've got is that person in the park that's just responding is not conscious that they're responding, okay? They're just on autopilot, because the map will run these programs. And we do this. I mean, have you ever had it where you say, right, I'm not going to eat any chocolate today, and suddenly you're sitting there eating chocolate? You're like, what happened? Like, really? You just lost consciousness, you just followed it. But here's where it gets more interesting. You can also be conscious of it, but not be able to control it. So one of the ladies in our group, she works in corporate. She's a lovely lady. She's very intelligent, very clever. She was outside one of the schools handing out flyers. The headmistress came out and said, I want to see you in my office. And then she felt like a little girl. Yeah, straight away, she was nervous and she couldn't speak properly and all these things. She didn't consciously decide to do that. That was the part of the brain that said, right, this is, because what the role of emotions become very key, because the emotions, the primary function of emotion is to alert us to safety or opportunity. And when you think about selling stuff to us, it's always about our safety being threatened, or there's a big opportunity. And then what happens is the emotions rise, okay? And then the emotions motivate us to move. And then what they do is they prepare the body for what we're about to do. So if you think about COVID, what they did was 24/7, scare the shit out of everyone, but not all of it was conscious. It was just loads of pictures, lots of these very simple messages. Now they make it into the unconscious mind. So the unconscious mind is literally scanning. Do I need to be concerned about this? Should I be scared or not? And of course, they managed to get through to a huge, like billions of people, to convince them this was a very dangerous thing. What happens is that part of the brain that goes emotional, it then codes into the map very irrational statements. And this is where, when you start to talk to people, I had a conversation with one person, And I was explaining why the masks don't work, and probably everyone here has had that same conversation 100 times. And it's when the realization that you can't reason with an irrational person. So if he's in the emotional part of the brain being driven by emotions and deep needs, logic has no effect whatsoever. So he then said this statement to me. He said, well, I would wear the mask if it was 0.0000006% effective. I said, you'd never leave the house. Okay. Driving has a much bigger risk than that. You wouldn't do anything, but that literally made sense to him. Because what's going on, when the emotional mind kicks in, the rational mind, a lot of the time will justify what's going on, which is why when someone's acting irrationally, the sentence that does not have any impact is to ask them why they're doing that. So if you ask someone why they're wearing a mask or why they've taken a shot or why they several lockdowns, they're going to give you such strange responses, okay? And you've only got to look at Twitter and Facebook and these other things to see highly intelligent people, some of them with PhDs, tweeting stuff that's just absolutely ludicrous. Because once you get into that emotional part of the mind, it's completely irrational at times.
Yeah, and I think this is something I'd like to explore more. And there's been some discussion in the chat around postmodernism. You know, as if we look through, and I've had a number of different guests on my podcast recently talking about the changes in worldview. We've had Jeff Salzman, we've had Steve McIntosh, Jeremy Lent, all speaking into the same evolution of how we see the world and going from traditionalism to modernism, which were both really grounded in, particularly modernity, grounded in kind of rationality. It's kind of the age of enlightenment, objectivity. And then along came the kind of 1960s, and there was a great shift. And you can understand that there was a response to something that had become really tightly constricted around rationality, this, you know, a different form of conformity driven by probably an excess in rationality. But as a result, now this postmodernist worldview is largely driven by subjectivism, emotion over objectivity and rationality. And as a result, you're seeing people entering in or engaging in conversation from two different arenas, in the sense that you may have one person speaking around logic and rationality, and another objectivity, and another speaking from ideology, emotion, or subjectivity. And I saw a fantastic quote that said that if you are to enter into a debate, you need to agree the terms of the debate. You're either both arguing around an ideology, or you're addressing the facts. And what I'm seeing, or what I've seen regularly throughout this period, is not only a deference to authority, but actually this emotional pattern that you've referred to, which I really find interesting on the basis that fear itself drives us into that emotional sense, where we're more prone to become emotional. So I'd be interested to get your view on, you know, that disconnect between emotion and logic, and why that's so challenging when it comes to debate or discussion.
Yeah, well, I think if you go back to the objectivity illusion itself, which Lee Ross has a TED talk on this, and it's quite brilliant. And it's this illusion that we are objective. We can't be. We're not taking in all the data from the world. We have to have a single perspective from our viewpoint. And this is why you have lots of consulting techniques where you stand in someone else's shoes and you look from different viewpoints and you try and obtain objective data. And what the behavioral science team worked out is that historically they would rely on a lot of surveys, but then they realized the surveys were, people don't do what they say. Yeah, they don't often understand why they have viewpoints. So here's a classic example. They were doing this study where they were playing a certain type of music in a supermarket and measuring the sales of certain wines. When they played French music, the French wine sales were like 77%. When they played German music, the German was the predominant sale. So the music was mostly, only one person admitted to actually hearing the music. The music was outside of the person's conscious awareness. It was subliminal. but it affected their purchase decision. When they were asked whether it did, they said, no, it didn't. So what you got is that the surrounding data that we're exposed to has an effect on our mood, what we fancy. You know, you'll walk past a signboard of a food and you won't even be aware of it. And then suddenly you'll fancy that food, potentially. So this is what happens. And it's understandable why this would be the case. If you're looking for food and then your brain remembers that you passed a tree, you know, go back 10,000 years ago, and you passed a tree 2 days ago, your brain would know that, and it would alert you to a feeling, because a lot of the time you wouldn't be able to recover the memory, but you'd have a feeling to go somewhere. So that's your brain understanding, because it records everything. So a lot of it's on feelings. So we're predominantly moving towards pain and away from pleasure. So what you've got is this disconnect, which is quite, I mean, I've got a lot of friends in Sydney. And one thing that astounded me about a lot of the friends I had in Sydney is how when I was there, which was back in 2009, I considered them very logical, rational, I can only imagine the propaganda in Australia for the last 10 years has been incredible. I remember having a conversation with one of them where I was literally quoting medical studies and doing my best to be logical. And he was saying, I can't believe how emotional and illogical you are and how you won't listen to my logic. And I'm sitting there thinking, his argument to me was completely illogical and irrational. Because what's going on is it's pretty much, as I think someone popped in the chat, most people are deferring or outsourcing to the experts, adopting that viewpoint, and then thinking that's their viewpoint, that they've, you know, it's theirs, but it's actually been given to them. So what you have, and this is where we come onto this term down that we talked about before, which is the illusion of explanatory depth. And this is where it's very fascinating, because the brain's always kind of, because even our eyesight, you know, there's something like during the day, I think it's something like 4 hours, we're actually blind, but our eyes and our brain fills in the gap so we don't notice. Yeah, because it's like these flicking images apparently, but so we don't notice that thing. So effectively, the conscious mind can be completely unaware of something. And if you've got people like Derren Brown and David Blaine, they do it, they show really extreme circumstances of this. But the person, my friend in Sydney, was absolutely convinced that he was the one in the right and I was being completely illogical. And that's what his brain was doing to him. Now, this is when we understand that from his viewpoint, we can start to really think, okay, so what can I do? And this is where you can literally, and I think Jordan Peterson's done this a few times quite brilliantly. We showed a video last night where he's talking to Kate, I think it was on, I can't remember what her surname was, but she was basically having a go at him because he was saying that it's okay, he can offend people in the pursuit of truth. He then said to her, but that's what you're doing now. You're digging and risking offending me in the pursuit of truth. And then she hit cognitive dissonance. Okay, right in that moment. And and it's a beautiful video because she just hits it. So what you've got is within, you know, recall my friend in Sydney, you know, when he was talking, he was absolutely convinced he's correct. Now, if I can point him towards something where he realizes he's not, more than likely he's just going to disengage. So then the question is, what's going on? So there's this false sense of security with what we believe is true. And I would say that a lot of the viewers here will be more true than the average person because you've gone out your way to search. That's the key. But the brain does this to us. So one of the things is just ask someone what science means when they're telling you they're following the science. Most people won't be able to answer. So what you have, and this is, I think, one of the most key points, most people's understanding is being given to them in a story, okay, through the media and from everything else. So what they have is they have a surface storyline in their brain, and they've also got this illusion that it has a lot of depth to it. And it's only when you start questioning them on the details, they suddenly realize they don't know the details of it. It becomes very uncomfortable. Cognitive dissonance is triggered and they pull back. And here's the classic cognitive dissonance that I think we've all witnessed. I'm so grateful I got blah, 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 because I caught COVID 3 times, but it would have been so much worse if I didn't have XYZ. Okay. Now think about that on the surface. That seems ludicrous, doesn't it? Okay. If you did the same thing for your dog and rabies, you know, like my dog had a rabies shot, but it caught rabies 3 times, you'd be thinking maybe that didn't work. Now, do you want to know why they say that? Okay. Because it's really interesting. In their map, it says this gene therapy works. Okay. And then they've just had an experience that says it didn't work. Okay. So you've got 2 ideas now, which is a train wreck. They are basically banging into each other. That is what is known as cognitive dissonance. Now, what they're now looking for is that whenever you have this train wreck of ideas, your brain is always looking for the easiest way out as soon as it can. So the person has 2 options. They either decide that the jab's not as good as they were told it was, or they rationalize, oh, it would have been so much worse if I didn't have it. And have a guess, Dan, which is the easier route out there?
Well, quite clearly the latter.
Yes. And of course, that will be largely unconscious, because Leon Festinger, who coined the term cognitive dissonance, showed that it was actually mostly an unconscious process. And what you can do is you can create the situation where they created it with masks. So masks created massive cognitive dissonance. So what it is, cognitive dissonance, 2 ideas clash. So basically one idea was, oh, this piece of cloth on my face can't possibly prevent, stop a virus. And the other one was, you're mandated to wear it. Okay. So you've got to choose one. You either, push against, and a lot of people, want an easy life. I mean, they just want to get on with their lives. So a lot of people caved in when it was mandated. Yeah. Now, you've then got dissonance if you cave in, because you believe they don't work, but now you're doing something that doesn't work. Okay. Now, since one of those has to give, so you either have to stop the behavior or you have to change your belief. So then what you'll find is a lot of people will change their belief unconsciously and then start supporting the use of masks. They won't know why, because the brain is doing it for them. And then when you challenge them on it, they will get absolutely angry, because the dissonance triggers this discomfort. Now, you could look at any one subject on this. This is what keeps happening, this dissonance, in that you got 2 ideas that clash. The person looks for the easy route out. It's that path that's been walked. And when you've got loads of influencers, because one of the big things is we tend to look at influencers tweeting, oh, I'm so glad I got this because it would have been so much worse. That is the pathway already walked, that when someone gets it, they're going to say that. Can you see how this starts to really play out now?
Absolutely. I mean, the repetition, I was reading my journal. I keep a daily journal, and I write quite profound amounts of words on a daily basis about my observations of the world. And looking back at my journal notes from early in 2020, I commented how there's almost like this parrot-like effect where phrases became repetitive. People were using the same lines over and over to describe the situation. It was like listening to a robot at times. People, and when you look at some of the kind of media narratives, there's a fantastic example within one of the documentaries that's been circulating over the last couple of months, where they've clearly got a coordinated media message around a certain phrase. They've also got we've seen certain posts that have been coordinated across social media, and all of that is true. However, you also have people in your own friendship network who for sure aren't being paid by the government or the media to say the same thing, yet they're still parroting the same thing.
Yes, because that's when it's in the map. What you've done is you've built a pathway, a sentence. So it's effectively a script. It's a bit like, when you phone up the bank, and you wait for an hour and a half to talk to someone, and then they come out, they've got a script. Okay. They've got a script of what they're going to say. And that's what's going on. See, this is the thing. When you think about the sort of types of language we use, so much of it comes from the stories that we watch and we listen to, and predominantly now the stories of people watching movies and TV shows. So you'll see, this is a fascinating, we did a project in looking through all the old TV programs and looking at what is the moral that's sitting under the surface that people are going to realize. And then what you see is, then you can see that, you know, they do this thing in fashion where they know tipping points and all these things. So you've effectively got pre-prepared scripts that people access, and it's much easier than thinking yourself, isn't it? You know, so here's the pre-prepared script. So I think you could literally map out what someone will respond to when you could just say certain things, and you'd hear, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Are you one of those? Are you at blah, blah, blah? Are you this? Are you that? But here's one of the most interesting ones I noticed, because if you think about, you've got two pathways, okay? You're a person, you've come to a junction, you've got two pathways. One pathway is to comply. One pathway is to not comply. The comply route has got loads of carrots and, you know, shiny objects and people patting you on the back. And the not comply route has got loads of monsters trying to murder you, right? So you know that most people are going to go down one. But what if they closed off that other one? Okay, so you literally only had one route. You might even sense where I'm going here, okay? Because if you only had one thought, okay, it would be the only way out. You remember that phrase? Okay, everyone is going to parrot that to you. Because if you go for the media, I'm sure you'll see that spoken thousands of times. If you think that you're going to drive somewhere and there's only one motorway towards that town, that's the only motorway that you know, that's the only way you think you can get there, and that's the only way you're going to travel. So if someone's constantly told the only way out of, so think about this, the whole population was locked down. Lockdown creates extreme trauma, okay? All your needs have been taken away. And then they said, do you want all that back? You've got to go down this one pathway and you get everything back that you've lost. You see how very persuasive that is. And then they tell people it's the only way out. I've had so many like clever people say to me, but it was the only way out. And I don't even think they're conscious. They're not their words. There's someone else's words that have been placed into their mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, this is the challenge. And I mentioned in my rant earlier on my live about having recently watched The Social Dilemma. And, you know, we talk about social media algorithms, but really human beings kind of operate to algorithms ourselves. And the reason why behavioral science within the context of social media has become so effective is that they can, with enough data points, pretty much predict what you're going to think about something, how you're going to feel, what actions you'll take, when you'll do things. They have so much data that they start to get a picture of who you are, not only as a character, but also the way you think, feel, and act. And we live in a world now where the dopamine hit that people get from social media is like the dopamine hit people get from food they enjoy, but it replicates the kind of drug addiction pattern. You mentioned addiction earlier. And now we're so connected digitally, yeah, perhaps more disconnected physically than we've ever been. But as a result, you know, we have people who are glued to their phones, and these narratives, these stories are permeated throughout our screens at scale, which means that people aren't consciously seeking. I mean, most of us here are probably people who did go consciously seek information, and that's probably a point of difference. But for a large volume of people, would not consciously seek, and if they do consciously seek, it's from the same sources from which they originally generated their perspective that were kind of served up to them through the social media algorithms. So I can see the major problem here, and this is quite clearly not limited to COVID. You know, we've seen the scandals around Cambridge Analytica and democracy. I suppose what I'm curious to know is, what is the answer? Because this is very, very deeply problematic for the future of humanity.
Absolutely. Now I mean, to unpack that little piece that you just said there, we could go down so many avenues, but let's do in one part, which is false fixes. what you're effectively talking about is false fixes. Social media gives you the illusion of connection, gives you the illusion of being accepted. Okay, lots of things give you these. So effectively what's going on from what I can see from all the research is that there's two parts of your brain that govern, one part governs wants, one part governs needs. Historically, they were like a railway track. They were always connected. In fact, if you craved sugar, you would get fruit, nutrition, honey, etc., vegetables. If you crave connection, you'd have to meet and talk to someone. You literally had to get that thing that you wanted. Yeah, if you wanted to meet someone and be intimate, you'd literally have to go and meet them. You couldn't watch like 100 people on the screen or something. So, but what's happened is that some of these, and of course, when you think about something like 0.75% of the global population are psychopaths. Okay. Now, if you start getting those types of people having a lot of responsibility, then you've got a child in a sweet shop. So what you've got is that once they understood that it was actually much more profitable to give someone what they wanted, but make sure you didn't give them what they needed, you effectively got a hamster on the wheel. So you've got people constantly, right? So sugar is as a classic example. People that can't stop eating are malnourished. Let's for a moment exclude the psychological reasons people eat, because that's important, but it's a little bit complex. But let's just stick with the one thing that someone's craving food because they need nutrients. Let's say they need a combination of vitamins, but they're not getting them from their food. They're never going to be satisfied. So they're going to be continuously eating to try and be full, but they're not going to be full. Then the food companies, what they did was they worked out how many different elements in a particular food would make you feel satisfied. And then what did they do? They remove a few of them. So you're never full, you never feel happy, but you get the dopamine hit. Because the part of your brain's gone, did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? Yes. And there's another part of your brain that goes, but we didn't. And of course, what happens there is, you know about the inconsistent rewards, Dan? It's actually much better from a game designer to give someone inconsistent rewards than consistent rewards, because that drives the desire crazy. So what you have is that people have an itch they cannot scratch. And for most of us, it's not conscious because that part of the brain can't talk to you linguistically. You see, so society for me is based largely on false fixes and compulsion loops.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've certainly seen that played out in the way that the path out of COVID was presented, and how, you know, you take one of this product, but you'll need another, and then you'll need another. And you know what? August is coming, you'll need another, or sorry, autumn is coming. And it's as you talked about many times before, the needs and wants is that the need is never met as a result of that pattern.
That's it. And because what you've got is, if society functions with the needs not being met, you're going to have just hamsters spinning around the wheels in fight or flight mode most of the time. Give them bread and circus, they won't revolt. You've got these things where we're being played. We're being played by people that know how to play us, but we're also being pitted against the very people that are really on our side. So you slice the narrative down the middle, you convince half the people or whatever, you know, this works, and you convince the other half it doesn't work. But, you know, what you've got is then what they did was, is you notice that when you look at divide and conquer around, say, you know, lockdowns, you had a group of people that were rightly angered that, you know, someone's taken their freedom away, and then other people that are angry because they didn't lock down harder. Okay. So then you've got the people on either side arguing with each other. Who's missing from that picture? Okay. The people that are pushing the policy. But you see, the people that are pushing the policy know that if you do enough propaganda to blame the other person, and look through history. Okay. I mean, the immigrants have been blamed thousands of years. It's always find the scapegoat. Yeah. And even Rishi now is coming out doing the same thing, isn't it? The absolute hubris of the elites and the politicians to never take responsibility is quite amazing. You know, it's always someone else's fault.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That's a kind of condition of our current reality. And again, there's a lot more that I can explore around that with you, but maybe a good opportunity to invite some of our participants tonight to engage and ask some questions around what we've discussed. Are you happy for that, David?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So I think the best way to handle this is if you hit the reactions button on the Zoom, so we can see your digital hand up, then we can invite you to share. If you don't know where that is, just look down onto your screen. It says the word reactions. Failing that, I would say wave madly at me, but there's a lot of you. So if you just type in the comments that you have a question, and we can do that. So yeah, if you've got any comments, any points of discussion you'd like to bring to the table, any specific examples, any challenging conversations you've had that you'd like to dissect.
Actually, there's one point actually that I think is really worth mentioning that came out. I saw a video yesterday, and this really it's such an important point. This comedian dressed as a woman went before Science magazine, published a paper which was absolutely ludicrous. It was no science behind it, whatever, but because it agreed with the agenda of the paper, they happily published it and then offered him to come back. He was on purpose trolling them, and then they went around to 6 different science journals and got them published every time, because if you agree with the person pushing the party line, then you basically will be accepted. And that's what we see so common, isn't it? But yeah, it's very fascinating.
Yeah, there's actually an organization that has been doing that for many years, subverting the system. Actually, there's an activist group that have been doing that, and they've got countless, I forget the name of it now, but if anyone in the audience knows, please post it in the comments. But they've done it for years, just subverting the scientific journals and getting things published that are just quite literally made up or ludicrous. And the more in depth they look at how the credibility of science, and Peter in the comments has shared an interesting book around evidence-based medicine. I'm just going to try and find it so that we can share that. The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine, Exposing the Crisis of Credibility in Clinical Research. There is so much to this. Again, we could do multiple hours just on that subject, but we've got a couple of hands raised. Eileen, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, because I've got a friend who is still being asked to wear a mask somewhere, and because it's gone on for so long, I said to her, maybe there's no point in talking anymore about any science, because everyone can justify their own view. So my suggestion was to just ignore it and just say no. So I guess my question is, how much dialogue can we have with people at this stage? Because it's gone on so long that people, I guess, are just never going to change their view, either side. So we're kind of stuck.
Well, it can look like that way, Eileen, but in fact, there is a way to get through to people. There is a way to get things into the map, but it's not the way that most of us have been trying. So what you have is, if you present information to someone that differs from what they currently believe in basically a raw fact, all they're going to do is just hit dissonance and reject it. But if you're able to tell a story, or basically elicit a part of them that's a little bit more curious, you're going to see a different part of the mind accessed. For example, the reason that so much money was spent on radio advertising is because the part of the mind that objects is distracted when you listen to radio, because you're generally doing something else. And that's why the radio adverts work so much. So the way I look at this is basically the goal is to get the information into their map. So effectively, they've got to absorb it. That's the key. And you don't absorb information when you're given facts that differ from what you currently believe. So we've basically now designed 3 workshops around conversations, and there's about 20 elements that when you understand, it's like an obstacle course. So having a rational conversation with someone is like traversing an obstacle course, but we've got blindfolds on. 2 years ago, I didn't know these 20 things, but now we managed to elicit them one by one. And one of them is cognitive dissonance. So if you present a raw fact to someone, so let's say I tried to tell you that, you know, I'm trying to think of something that I can actually prove to be a fact now, which is kind of crazy in this world. But let's say I said the chair was a table, okay? You would just flat out reject that because in your view, it's not, okay? Which obviously right. But what they've managed to do is tell people very clever stories about how the table is the chair and how 2 + 2 = 5. And that's made it into the unconscious mind because they access, when someone goes into fear, they get irrational. So what you can do with people, and we've seen a lot of people shift their views. And the thing to understand is that people are shifting their views every single day. We're always shifting our views. It's just what the stimulus is. So look what happened the other day. The front page of the Telegraph, you know, posted that lockdowns didn't work and they probably killed more people than they saved. You're going to see a lot of the population now changing their viewpoint around that. So what it really is understanding to traverse the obstacle course and then managing to get a conversation. And here's the key part. The conversation has to be an open, circular conversation. What I mean by that is that we're not on opposing views. If we, let's say you consider yourself pro-science and you think I'm anti-science, I can't say anything you'll ever believe. I have to first get you to change your viewpoint about what group I'm in. That's probably one of the most key things. So what you have is a series of things that we need to go through. And it really, you just get very good at traversing the obstacles in the obstacle course. And then you'll get to the point which we can get to now is that you'll never get called a conspiracy theorist and you'll be able to plant a seed or two at least. But there's so many obstacles that until you know they're there, we trip over them.
Thanks.
Thank you. That really helps. Thank you. I did hear someone say that if you just say to the person, we're on the same side,
yes,
that really helps.
That really does, because what they've got, see, this is why the media's, its thing is to paint the group of people speaking up as immoral. Once you think a group is immoral, you dismiss everything they say, and you also start supporting violence towards them if you're not conscious. So what you've seen is, like, look at people like Andrew Neil, where they said, oh, we should lock up the unvaccinated and all these things. He's acting from fear, and to him, because fear acts irrational, that feels rational to him. That makes sense? Because once you're acting from that fear place, the irrational becomes rational when you justify. So yeah, being on the same side is really key. There's some wonderful stories we've got where people didn't say any facts. They were just really nice to people, and then the person changed their view. Yeah, because they realized actually this person isn't crazy, because it's really easy to dismiss a crazy person.
Thank you, David. I think the piece you've made there around the way that people's group identity is perceived is such an important piece. There was an interesting spat on Twitter where two well-qualified scientists were basically calling each other anti-science. But again, when you actually looked at their positioning, both were coming, one was coming from data, fact, and the other was coming from an ideological perspective. So interestingly, that both had seen each other's response as anti-science, yet one in alignment with what you said, David, about, you know, the thing is published because it meets the kind of dominant narrative. So it's almost like one was anti-science with a small s and the other
Yes.
There's science with a capital and one with a small s. One is for ideology and one is for rational observable fact.
Well, this is the cosmic joke, because the people that called someone, like, we project, as humans we project. So a lot of the time people will project onto you what they're doing. So people that will act like they're in a cult would literally ask if you've joined a cult. The amount of people that I see in, you know, that are challenging things, and they say, oh, have you joined a cult? What, a cult of asking questions? Like, because you could then, because probably the best answer is to say, you know, not the best one to be friendly, but the best one to get them to really think is, so how do people in cults act? Okay, but here's the thing, most people don't know. They've got this concept of what a cult is, but if they knew detailed how cults act, they would see a lot of similarities with people that are just blindly following authority. Yeah, so that the projection is kind of incredible. The way people call those questioning, calling them anti-science when questioning, literally should be one of the most important things in science.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you. Anna's got a hand raised. Anna, can we come to you? I've got a couple of questions in the chat that I'll pose to you afterwards, David, as well.
Sure.
Oh, hi. It wasn't so much a question as an observation. You know, I'm separated now, and it's because of all of this. My husband refused to look at any of the the actual science, like the actual science. He believed everything that was told to him, and his justification for completely shutting me out and wanting to get these injections was so that he could travel. End of story. He needed to go to a car show in the States. And so to him, everything I said was going against his ability to do that. So he completely ignored everything, didn't want to hear anything, actually screaming and shouting, because if he listened, he would continue to be locked down. So, I mean, it just boggles the imagination.
It does. And of course, when you understand, because I think we spoke about this before, didn't we, Anna, that when you think about what's going on, so let's come back to the animal part of the mind and the rational part of the mind. The animal part of the mind is trying to get its needs met, and it will do. I mean, there's people that, you know, say someone, their deep needs are met by smoking, say. People, you know, I remember one of the lecturers I studied under, he said that he had one patient that had had his throat cut open basically to be able to breathe again, and he was smoking through the hole in his throat.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when the part of our brain says, in order to feel okay, you need to do this, we can if we're not able to control that, then, I mean, look at drug addicts, right? The pure desire is almost impossible to overcome. So what the people pushing the agenda knew was what was all the pain points. Okay, so you notice it was this massive checklist of, oh, if we do this and we do this and we do this and we do this, the absolute desire that people will have to walk down that pathway will be unstoppable. And it's really quite unfair. And it's really, as those of us that can see what's going on, it is challenging to be able to understand the kind of viewpoint of someone that did it. Okay, and I have to say, it's one of the, I think it's an important thing, because when we understand, we can really see from their perspective, but it's not easy to get to that viewpoint. And for your husband, it sounds like when you were describing it, a lot of it was unconscious, wasn't it? Acting like a child, as Dan talked about, you tend to see this unconscious mind, people act like children.
Yes, but I mean, he was aware of what he was doing in a sense, because at one point he said, and this was later after I'd already left and we were settling things out, he says, I almost think that this will never change until everyone, and he stopped, because what he was going to say was everyone gets vaccinated.
Yeah, but that's the only way out. You see, because effectively, when you look at something like communism, okay, people at the end of a lot of the communist countries were well aware what was going on, okay, but they were just saying, oh, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to go along for an easy life. And that's what you'll get a lot of people where, you know, it's relatively straightforward to understand learned helplessness, and a lot of situations can create it. When someone feels that they have no control over their situation, they're going to want to cave in, but they want everyone else to cave in. Yeah. Oh,
and that's the thing. He wants everyone to be like him.
Yeah, because then there's this illusion that once we've given total power over to the state, then they're going to be very nice to us. Yeah. I think you've only got to pick up a history book to know that's not the way these things go. When you give up your right to defend yourself, they don't stop attacking. You know, but yeah, you can see the you know, the sort of fragmented logic that someone would have, and it's just coming from fear.
Yeah. But it's actually, it's a good thing because at some point, like a person will actually stop fighting. I'm at the point now where I'm just not fighting anymore, and saying things that actually makes another person think, and it's thanks to you and all of these
Yes.
Zooms
That's
that
what,
you've been using.
brilliant. Yeah, because you can start getting really effective. Because the first thing we have to do is not react ourselves, isn't it? We've spoken about that. It's so key. And then you imagine you start getting thousands of people being very effective. The change is going to come a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, David, there's been a few on that point. We've got a guest coming up on the podcast who's going to talk about reconciliation. We know a lot of people who, some have gone through irrevocable kind of breakups, but a lot of people have fallen out of friendships, colleagues, associates, and quite a few people in our community have expressed a desire to approach this from a place of reconciliation. So we've got a guest who will be joining us on the show to talk about that in particular, and we're hoping he'll do an interactive session like this one with our community. So look out for that. David, there's been a couple of linked questions in the chat, which I'll try and pull together. So Vicky's asked, what makes those of us who question a narrative and push back different from those who bought into it? And Keith went on to add that quite a few of his fellow Stand in the Park crew have experienced trauma earlier in life. Is that something that could lead people to be more aware of these control type issues? So perhaps a broader answer, but also the specific reference to the kind of trauma point would be interesting.
Yeah, well, this, if I had £1 for every time we ask this question, because it is a really key question, it's one we all always ask. And the more I study it, I'm really at this point where, remember we talked about single cause fallacy. So as humans, we often have the tendency to think that one thing causes one thing. But invariably, it's many things cause many things. So what you have is that the trauma will certainly play a part. And I think it's a positive thing largely. When you look at evolution, you get your fingers burnt, you're a little bit careful. So when you learn that a certain thing going on doesn't mean certain thing, it's a learning. And obviously it's important to resolve the trauma. And I think there's a lot of really great techniques now that can do that. But you're going to learn from that experience. So I think trauma does play a big part. And I think when you look at a lot of people, they will have had an experience where, certainly for me, I had an experience when I was 21, where I was rushed into the hospital. They absolutely made completely scared the shit out of me, basically telling me there was something seriously wrong, and then realized there was nothing wrong. It was just something very minor. And I was left thinking, they have no idea what they're doing. And I just thought, how could, and it was so scary that it was something that I couldn't avoid. And then I spent a lot of time looking into natural health and everything else and realized, actually, I'm better off preventing any. So that really sort of jarred me awake into sort of healthcare. And I think that when you have those experiences, it breaks a bond. Okay. And of course, it's a thing like this, there comes a time when someone's in an abusive relationship where the bond just breaks and they get away, and it's hard to describe what all those elements are. You have another element, which is, it's almost like software. So when I was at school, we studied 1984, we studied Animal Farm. We literally had debates afterwards to ask for opinion. We're building the ability to critically think. Yeah. And you'll get a lot of people that have this. And it's not all the scientists, because I think critical thinking and intelligence are two different things. And I think critical thinking is much more important. It's the ability to challenge your own ideas. It's the ability to outframe all these things. So I think that's another key element. So you've got the trauma's key. I think the critical thinking's key. I think understanding human behavior is important. I think psychologists, I think there's almost this rich, sort of buffet of many things that could alert you to what's going on. Certainly what we noticed when I asked everyone that considered themselves pretty aware what's going on, why it was, everyone had a story. And a lot of those stories, if it was recent, was that something happened close to them. It might have been an uncle died, or someone fell down the stairs and broke their neck and they put COVID on the death cert. something that went outside the boundaries of acceptable. So when something is so jarred outside of the boundaries, because a lot of the things happen, it happens within a boundary and it doesn't really alert us. But when it goes outside that boundary, it breaks the bond. And I think what you'll find is that with the narrative, I think the two strongest pillars that are holding the whole thing up is, one is trust in the system, and two is this consensus. Okay. And I think you could argue that authority is a very key one as well.
Thank you, David. An observation I've made on this is quite. I don't have any substantive data on this. It's just kind of observed reality around people's balance between their own rationality and subjectivity, in that they have what I would call a sense of yin and yang around their own use of logic and emotion. As a result, I think there's almost a deeper resonance with being able to both empathize and understand with emotion, but also to empathize, understand, and operate with logic. It's very much anecdotal and observational with a small scale, but my sense is that there is a number of people that have a very good balance of that logic and emotion and ability to empathize in both ways, which I think is a characteristic I've seen within our communities.
Yeah, and you certainly see people, I think a lot of it as well is they're very much heart-based. It's much harder to convince the heart than it is the mind. Yeah, so when people are stuck in logic in the mind, you can come up with logical arguments to convince people of all sorts of things. But when people start to tune into their body, they start to, I don't know what, there was one lady, she said, I said, what made you aware? She said, I was watching Matt Hancock and I got a terrible feeling in my stomach and I just knew he was lying. She couldn't logically tell you why. It was a feeling. And of course, it's very hard to lie to the heart. That really tends to answer. But I think you made some really interesting points there, which is very important. And we are the easiest people to fall. It's so easy to fall ourselves. Yeah. And that was Richard Feynman's quote. He said, you have to be careful you don't fall yourself, and you're the easiest person to fall. In our story of our lives, we're the hero and there's someone else as the villain. Okay. And we tend to edit the story. It's just common human nature that, we will edit it in our favor. To be completely objective is really, almost impossible. And it's just to be kind to ourselves, to know that's what we're doing, and just to be very gentle.
Indeed. So, David, we're 8 o'clock and I actually need to move on for another commitment, but I'm happy to put you in the host seat if you want to take it. There's a couple more questions from Angela and Debbie,
sure.
And so I can hand over to you. I want to say thank you to everyone from the Elevate community who's with us here, and welcome to David's Reaching People community. We've joined forces tonight to bring you this experience. A very quick plug for Elevate. If you're not yet part of our online social network, you can reach us at weareelevate.org. We host frequent events like this. Obviously, we have the Elevate podcast. If you haven't come across that yet, we're examining some of the systemic and deeper understandings of what's been happening over the last couple of years. But you'd be very welcome to join us inside weareelevate.org, where we host other conversations like this that you can take part in. So I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to David. I'm going to hand over to David for the final part of the evening for those of you who want to stick around. Those who are regular Elevate event attendees know that we never finish on time. We're such deep, curious people that we keep on going. So I'll hand the baton to David to close out to the final furlong. So thank you to everyone, and I'll see you all soon.
And thank you, Dan, for hosting this. It's been a wonderful conversation as always.
My pleasure. Thank you. Over to you.